First, though, let's talk about the Canada-U.S. border. Reopening that border will be a priority in talks this weekend between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden. They meet at that G7 summit. So how soon could the border fully reopen? We're going to ask Bill Blair, the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. He is in Toronto. Minister Blair, lots to cover with you on the program today. Thanks very much for joining us on Power and Politics. And I want to start with the border. Congressman Higgins from New York has been on our program advocating for the reopening of the U.S.-Canada border. And he says the President and the Prime Minister will actually discuss this very issue at the G7. So when can Canadians expect something to come out of those conversations in terms of reopening that Canada-U.S. border?
Yeah, David, there's been very important ongoing conversations between our officials, myself and my counterpart, the Secretary Mayorkas in charge of Department of Homeland Security, and of course now between the Prime Minister and the President. We understand how important, both economically and socially, the interactions and the integration of the Canadian-U.S. border is to so many border communities. I've also reached out to a number of the border mayors who've conveyed the same concerns to me. But David, we always follow the advice of the Public Health Agency, and it's based on the evidence and the advice that we receive from our medical professionals in order to make sure that the steps, the processes we have in place to control the movement and transit of people across our borders is informed by that evidence. As the Health Minister indicated yesterday, we do believe that the vaccination of Canadians, the full vaccination of Canadian travelers, is going to allow us to begin to take steps to ease some of the restrictions at the border. We'll do that carefully, of course, but we're very mindful of the impact that the border closures have had on those communities.
So you got to do something in under 3 weeks, June 21st, the next time the renewal of that border closure will have to take place. Can Canadians expect some change between now and then?
No, the restrictions that we have put in place, and as I said, we're working very closely with our American counterparts, but our decisions are based on the evidence and the advice that we received from the Public Health Agency of Canada and from our various advisory committees, scientific and health advisors. And so we are going to move cautiously. The order in council that currently is in place, that imposes the restrictions currently in place at our borders, is in place until June 21st. We are working very hard to look at the impact of vaccinations. There's also some ongoing and parallel work on vaccine certification, which is going to be very important to assist my border service officers in making the determination whether or not somebody meets the eligibility criteria that we put in place. But we're going to be able to move forward as more and more Canadians become fully vaccinated. And so we're building that evidence right into our decisions with respect to when border measures can be eased.
Okay, so let me ask you about fully vaccinated, because your government announced yesterday that fully vaccinated Canadians returning to the country will not need to go to quarantine hotels. They'll be able to go into quarantine at home. What about for partially vaccinated? When can they expect to skip the quarantine hotel?
Well, we want to encourage Canadians to become fully vaccinated, and our procurement people and our health officials are working day and night with our provincial and territorial partners and with regional health authorities to make sure that vaccines are available and Canadians can get vaccinated. We want to ensure that people get that second dose. It's a very important part of our health strategy, and I think that the easing of border measures will ultimately require that travelers be fully vaccinated in order to avoid the restrictions that are currently in place. As I said, David, we're going to do this carefully. We're going to do it based on the advice that we received from our public health officials. The safety and health of Canadians is our number one priority, but we do recognize the impact that those border closures have had, particularly on border communities. And so we're working with those communities, and we'll continue to rely on that advice and be ready when sufficient number of Canadians are fully vaccinated, that we'll be able to ease those restrictions for those who are thereby eligible.
So over the course of our conversation, Minister, you said you follow the advice of your public health officials 3 times. Your expert panel of public health officials said get rid of the quarantine hotels altogether right away. They just don't work in the way intended, and there's the disparity between the land and the air border. Why keep them if the advice has been from health officials to get rid of them?
Well, again, and I do understand the advice that we have received from that particular advisory body, but the Public Health Agency of Canada has managed that process of quarantine. I will tell you from experience over the past 15 months, quarantine has been overwhelmingly our most effective measure in slowing down the spread of the virus entering into Canada at our borders. And the measures that were put in place were based on that advice. We also believe now that for those who are fully vaccinated, that provide sufficient assurance for those persons that we can ease that restriction. But it will remain in place for the non fully vaccinated travelers until the advice is that it's safe for them to travel. And so we are following that advice. I'll also point out, David, that we quite responsibly are working with the provinces and territories. A number of the provinces have expressed some concern with respect to the border measures, and so we are not insensitive to their concerns, but at the same time we'll follow the best advice of our public health authorities.
I want to talk to you about pardon reforms, because you announced today that convicted criminals will be able to, for less money and in a shorter delay, in less time, be able to apply for a pardon. Critics have previously said that taxpayers should not be subsidizing the cost of doing that. Why was it important for you to lower the cost of doing this for convicted criminals?
Yeah, a couple of things, David. First of all, rehabilitation and successful reintegration in society is an important part of our public health strategy. For people who have served their time, completed their sentence, but are now law-abiding, and they want to engage fulsomely as productive participation in society. We want to make sure that that's possible, and unfortunately, David, some of the measures that were imposed almost a decade ago in this country resulted in a pardon system that was only accessible to the wealthy, and that's neither equitable or just. It has also created a situation where there's been a very significant disparate impact on racialized and Indigenous communities, and so we want a pardon system that is accessible to people. That the effect of a criminal record can actually extend well beyond, the criminal conviction. 74%, David, of the people Canadians that have a criminal record have never served a single day in jail, and yet they carry the burden of a criminal record throughout their life. And the criminal record's not intended to be a life sentence. And so we want to make sure that the pardon system is accessible, in not just in cost, but in administration, accessible to majority of Canadians. And at the same time, I want to be really clear, we are keeping in place ineligibility for people who are convicted, for example, of the sexual exploitation of children, for terrorist offenses where the penalties exceeded 10 years, for people who've received life and indeterminate sentences. But for the vast majority of Canadians, these criminal records are for certainly less serious offenses. And what we saw as a result of the imposition of stricter measures that were imposed nearly a decade ago, we saw more than half of the number of people applying stopped. And that's a strong indication that the system was made inaccessible to an awful lot of Canadians. And we want to make sure that Canadians who have served their time, paid their dues to society, and are now living law-abiding and productive lives have an opportunity to do so with full participation in the country. The criminal record can stop you from getting a job. It can stop you from getting access to decent housing or into a decent school. It can stop you from traveling.
Minister, I'm just going to jump in on you. I'm going to jump in on you, Minister, only because we're running out of time, and I would be remiss if I did not ask you about the horrific attack in London, Ontario, which happened Sunday night, killing 4 people in what police there describe as not just targeted, but targeted because of the faith, because the victims in this case were Muslim. As the minister responsible for public safety, how big an issue, based on the briefings you get, is white supremacy in this country?
Ideologically motivated violent extremists are the greatest threat to our domestic security in this country. The terrible tragedy that took place on Sunday in London, and I attended that vigil, and it was an incredibly moving experience as we listened to a community and a city and a country in mourning. But the threat of white supremacists, ideologically motivated violent extremists, is in my very sincerely held opinion, the greatest threat to our domestic security, and that's why we're taking steps. I will tell you that the national security intelligence agencies and our federal law enforcement authorities are turning their attention full time to the threat that domestic violence represents. And domestic threat to our security represents. We've already listed, as you're probably aware, a number of these white supremacist organizations as terrorist entities. There's more to come shortly, because there are a number that we've also identified. There are also important steps that we need to take with respect to some of the postings online of these harms. It's something that we're working full time on as well. But the events that took place on Sunday were clearly hate motivated. They were clearly racist, and they were clearly an act of terror. And I can confirm that this is being actively investigated as a terrorist act by the police authorities.
Finally, Minister, I want to talk to you about the RCMP. You're the minister responsible for the federal police force, and the Privacy Commissioner came out today very critical, found that the RCMP violated Canadian privacy laws. You will know that the RCMP at first denied using the Clearview AI facial recognition technology, only to later confirm that, in fact, it was doing so. This is something the Privacy Commissioner has taken clear exception with. The RCMP says they've stopped. Why, as minister responsible, did you not know before the federal agency started to use something as controversial at that time as Clearview AI?
Well, quite frankly, when the RCMP began using it, the Privacy Commissioner had not yet identified his concerns. But I want to, first of all, acknowledge and thank the Privacy Commissioner for his work on this area. And I'm happy to be able to advise you, David, that the RCMP has agreed to fully implement all of the Privacy Commissioner's recommendations. They're going to improve their policies, their systems, their training. There will always be a fulsome privacy assessment of third-party data, which the Privacy Commissioner asked us to do. And as well, we are creating a new oversight function within the RCMP to ensure that technologies are on board in a manner that respects individuals' privacy rights. And I'm very respectful of the Privacy Commissioner's work. I've worked with the RCMP Commissioner. They have accepted the recommendations made by Mr. Terry, and they are working hard to ensure that they will do the important work that the RCMP are tasked with doing, but they will also do it in a way which is respectful of Canadians' privacy rights.
Minister Blair, as always, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, David.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.